Isn't it true that you want to fly commercial so that you can fly in luxury? How much money did you pay for Tyler Perry's Gulfstream jet, for example?
Well, for example, that's really none of your business.
Those critics that say that a preacher should not be living a life of luxury, what is your response to that?
The car door hasn't even closed before the smile begins to curdle. Kenneth Copeland, a man who has spent 5 decades commanding the heavens and the wallets of millions, finds himself cornered on a hot Texas tarmac by a woman with a microphone and a question he wasn't prepared to answer. In this moment, the carefully curated mask of the prophet of prosperity doesn't just slip, it dissolves. His eyes, usually crinkled in a performative grandmotherly warmth, go cold and predatory. He points a finger, his voice dropping into a register that sounds less like a preacher and more like a threat, defending his need for a $65 million private jet because he cannot stand to be in a long tube with demons. It is the most honest thing he has ever said. Almost nobody noticed the precise moment the performance stopped being a tool and started being a prison. We're told that faith can move mountains, but for Kenneth Copeland, faith was something much more practical. It was a flight path. For over half a century, he has sat atop an empire worth an estimated $750 million, built on the promise that if you give your last dollar to him, God will return it 100-fold. But the wind of God is blowing in a different direction now. The digital age has turned his private eccentricities into global memes, his theological justifications into punchlines, and his aging empire into a case study of what happens when a man begins to believe his own myth. Things aren't just looking bad for Kenneth Copeland. The very foundation of his kingdom is beginning to crack under the weight of its own excess. The problem with claiming to speak for God is that eventually God is expected to show up. To understand how Copeland reached this precipice, you have to look past the mansions and the runways to a young man in the 1960s who discovered a terrifyingly effective psychological loophole. Before he was a preacher, Copeland was a pilot and a struggling singer with a minor gold record. He understood 2 things perfectly: the mechanics of flight and the mechanics of a crowd. When he joined the ministry of Oral Roberts, he didn't just find a calling, he found a business model. He saw that people weren't just looking for salvation, they were looking for permission to be rich. He realized that he could frame wealth not as a sin, but as a spiritual duty. He would never be poor again. But there was a hidden tax on this theology that he didn't see coming. By teaching his followers that financial struggle was a sign of weak faith, he inadvertently created a world where he could never afford to look human. To Copeland, a mechanical failure or a commercial flight wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a public admission of spiritual defeat. This is why the private jets became his obsession. They weren't just toys, they were his armor. If he stayed in the air, he was untouchable. If he landed among the demons in coach, he was just another man. The tragedy of Kenneth Copeland is that he built a life where the only way to prove he was blessed was to ensure he was never, ever like the people who paid for his life. Look closely at the footage from his 2020 Judgment on COVID-19 sermon, and you'll see the exact moment the spell broke for the rest of the world. Standing before an empty room, Copeland began to blow at the camera, claiming he was executing the wind of God to destroy the virus. Then came the laughing, a rhythmic, forced, terrifyingly hollow cackle that went on for nearly a minute. To his devotees, it was a display of spiritual power. To the rest of the world, it was the image of a man who had lost his grip on the shared reality of his audience. It was no longer about the gospel. It was about a man demanding the universe obey his theatrics. For the first time, the viral nature of the internet didn't spread his message. It exposed the absurdity of his isolation. The jet wasn't a luxury. It was a theological necessity that eventually became a liability. When the IRS and Senate investigators began sniffing around the tax-exempt status of church equipment like his Gulfstream 5, the defense was always the same. These are tools for the Lord's work. But as the flight logs emerged showing trips to ski resorts and vacation spots, the tool started looking like a getaway vehicle. The dark irony of the prosperity gospel is that it requires a constant upward trajectory. You cannot stagnate. You must always have a bigger plane, a larger house, a more golden altar. But Kenneth Copeland is now in his late 80s, and the trajectory is finally leveling off. The world he built to keep the demons at bay is now closing in on him. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a miracle that doesn't happen. For years, Kenneth Copeland told his followers they could talk to their checkbooks and command money to come to them. He told the sick that their healing was already done, provided their faith and their seed money was sufficient. But as his core audience ages and the promised returns fail to materialize, the seed faith model is facing a generational collapse. The younger demographic doesn't see a prophet, they see a tycoon in a suit that costs more than their student loans. The dark price isn't just the money lost by the widow in a trailer park. It's the spiritual vacuum left behind when a man claims to be the gatekeeper of God's favor and then uses that gate to keep the world out. If you watch him in his private moments, caught on camera when he doesn't think the red light is on, the charisma vanishes. You see a man who is profoundly tired of the performance, but terrified to stop. He has built a machine that requires millions of dollars a month just to stay idle. If the jets stop flying, the ministry dies. If the ministry dies, the legacy is nothing but a collection of controversial clips. He is a pilot who has climbed so high that he no longer knows how to land without crashing. He has spent decades telling his followers that fear is a choice, yet his entire existence is now defined by the fear of being seen as ordinary. The most telling detail of the Copeland empire isn't the tax records, it's the eyes. In that famous interview on the tarmac, when he was asked about his comments regarding demons on commercial flights, his face underwent a transformation that psychologists call narcissistic rage. For a few seconds, the charismatic grandfatherly preacher was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he wanted to strike the interviewer down. It was the look of a man who realized that his money could buy him a jet, it could buy him a mountain, but it could no longer buy him the one thing he craved most: unquestioned authority. The long tube, he feared, wasn't the airplane, it was the lens of a camera he couldn't control. As we move into the final act of this story, the question isn't whether Kenneth Copeland will lose his money. He is far too wealthy for that. The question is what remains when the applause finally ends. He is currently navigating a world where his theology is being dismantled by a new generation of believers who see wealth not as a sign of grace, but as a symptom of greed. His family, deeply embedded in the ministry, faces the impossible task of inheriting a kingdom built entirely on the personality of a man who is becoming a caricature of himself. The succession plan is a map of a territory that no longer exists. The cruelest thing about his fame was not what it did for him, it was the psychological debt he placed on the people who believed him. He sold them a version of God that was essentially a heavenly vending machine, and when the machine didn't work, he told them it was their fault. He didn't just take their money, he took their right to suffer with dignity. He made their poverty a sin and their illness a failure of will. Now, as the sun sets on his era, the bill is finally coming due. He is an old man in a very large house, surrounded by the ghosts of promises he couldn't keep. Stop here for a moment and look at the image of the man again. He isn't a cartoon villain, and he isn't a simple con artist. He is something much more tragic, a man who traded the pursuit of the divine for the pursuit of the decimal point. He believed that if he could just get high enough, if he could just fly fast enough, he could outrun the inherent vulnerability of being human. But the ground is always there waiting. Things aren't looking good for Kenneth Copeland because he has finally run out of altitude, and the demons he spent a lifetime avoiding are the only ones left to tell his story. When the history of this era is written, he won't be remembered as a man of God. He will be remembered as the man who turned the pulpit into a cockpit and then wondered why no one followed him into the clouds. The jet is still on the tarmac, the engines are running, but for the first time in 50 years, Kenneth Copeland has nowhere left to fly.